pawn to d4, knight to f6, knight to f3, pawn to d5, bishop to f4, pawn to c5, pawn to e3, pawn to e6, pawn to c3, bishop to d6, bishop to d3, bishop to f4, pawn to f4, queen to b6, queen to c2, pawn to d4, knight to d4, knight to c6, knight to f3, king to g8, king to g1, bishop to d7, knight to d2, rook to c8, pawn to a3, rook to d8, rook to e1, pawn to h6, knight to e5, knight to e5, pawn to e5, knight to e8, knight to f3, bishop to b5, bishop to h7, king to h8, pawn to a4, bishop to a6, queen to b1, pawn to g6, bishop to g6, pawn to g6, queen to g6, queen to c7, queen to h6, queen to h7, queen to h7, king to h7, knight to g5, king to g8, knight to e6, rook to d7, rook to e3, knight to g7, knight to d4, rook to f8, pawn to e6, rook to e7, pawn to g4, pawn to b6, rook to e1, bishop to c8, king to g2, rook to e8, king to g3, bishop to e6, pawn to h4, king to f8, pawn to h5, bishop to g8, rook to e7, rook to e7, rook to e7, king to e7, king to f4, knight to e6, knight to e6, bishop to e6, king to g5, king to f7, pawn to a5, pawn to a5, pawn to f4, king to g7, pawn to f5, bishop to d7, pawn to h6, king to h7, king to f6, king to h6, king to e7,